Get out! I never want to see you again!" The raw, guttural scream tore through the silence of the marble entryway, echoing off the high ceilings like shattered glass. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of my son, Ethan. And he was only 8 years old. He stood rigid by the staircase, his small fists clenched, tears streaming down cheeks that were usually dimpled with laughter, his fury directed entirely at the man who was supposed to be his hero, his father. Michael froze, halfway down the hall, his face pale, the carefully constructed facade of indignation finally crumbling. That sound, that absolute, soul-destroying rejection from his own child, was the price of the lie. My name is David. That moment, that instant where our perfect life dissolved into ash and grief, happened yesterday. But to understand the devastating finality of Ethan's words, you have to rewind 6 weeks. Back to a time when I still believed the scent of jasmine on my husband's collar was nothing more than an expensive laundry detergent. For 10 years, Michael and I built a life that seemed impervious to the usual stresses of the world. We had the house in the suburbs, the demanding but rewarding careers, and Ethan, our brilliant, funny, slightly chaotic centerpiece. Michael was a successful architect, meticulous, charming, and deeply attentive. Our routine was sacred. Saturday morning pancakes, Sunday hikes, and the predictable rhythm of Michael's business trips, which usually meant a few days of quiet solitude for me before he returned, energized and loving. The air in our home always smelled faintly of roasted coffee and the specific, sophisticated scent of Sarah's tuberose perfume, my best friend who often visited, but whose smell never lingered on Michael. It started subtly, a distraction barely worth mentioning. Michael came home late from what he called a critical pitch meeting in the city. He smelled different, not of stale office air or city grime, but something warm, deep, and overwhelmingly floral. Jasmine mixed with sandalwood, perhaps, a smell far too luxurious for a client meeting. I hugged him tightly, breathing it in. "New cologne?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He stiffened slightly, pulling back faster than usual. "No, just the elevator, maybe. Someone was wearing something heavy." He shrugged it off, kissing me quickly on the forehead before heading, straight to the shower. The scent vanished, and I dismissed it. People wear perfume. It's New York. 2 weeks later, the smell returned, stronger this time, lingering on the silk lining of his suit jacket when I took it to the dry cleaner. It was the same distinct blend. My stomach clenched, a cold, hard knot of anxiety forming where easy trust used to reside. Michael had always been transparent, almost excessively so. This quick dismissal felt forced. "That smell is back," I pointed out the next evening, carefully watching his eyes as he scrolled through his phone. "It's not the elevator, Michael. It smells like a high-end spa product." He sighed, exasperated, putting the phone down with a controlled thud. "David, honestly, are we doing this again? It's probably your shampoo rubbing off on my shirts." I was in a taxi. The driver smelled like incense. "Stop looking for problems where there are none." He leaned in, offering a kiss that felt less affectionate and more like a distraction. "We're fine. It's probably your shampoo," he repeated, the phrase delivered with such condescending confidence that it settled the doubt, replacing it with certainty. He wasn't just lying, he was insulting my intelligence. The lie was the trigger. I knew I couldn't confront him without proof, because his denial would be absolute. The investigation phase was clinical, fueled by a terrifying calmness. I started checking his things, before the dry cleaning claimed them. It took 3 days before I found it. Tucked deep inside the coin pocket of his favorite trousers, folded neatly, was a small embossed receipt. It wasn't for dinner or drinks. It was for a full 2-hour therapeutic massage and relaxation session. The date matched the night he claimed to have been closing a deal. The total cost was obscene, but the name of the establishment was everything. The Azure Retreat. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I simply picked up the phone. I called the Azure Retreat, and using my most confident professional voice, I impersonated a slightly disgruntled client. I'm calling about the session booked yesterday for the full body wrap and aromatherapy under the name M. Peterson. Could you possibly confirm the exact essential oil blend used? My husband loved it, and I want to replicate the scent at home. There was a moment of awkward silence on the line, followed by the receptionist's overly cheerful confirmation. "Ah, yes, Mr. Peterson's wife. That was the custom jasmine and Moroccan sandalwood blend. It's very popular." My blood turned to ice. Mr. Peterson's wife. The next move was brutal in its simplicity. I booked the exact same 2-hour session for myself the following afternoon. I needed to see who else was there. I needed to breathe the air, to feel the atmosphere that had been shared. Driving across the city felt like moving through water. When I arrived, the lobby was silent, filled with the faint, cloying scent of that custom jasmine blend. I checked in, but instead of heading toward the changing rooms, I pretended to take an urgent call and positioned myself near the exit, my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited 20 minutes, and then the glass door slid open. A woman emerged, dressed in expensive athleisure wear, her hair damp, a look of sublime relaxation softening her sharp features. She was beautiful, effortlessly chic, and completely unfamiliar. But as she moved past me, the smell hit me like a physical blow. That precise, unmistakable blend of jasmine and sandalwood radiating from her warm skin. She had just finished a session. I didn't need a picture. I didn't need a confession. I knew, with the sickening certainty of a final diagnosis, that this woman was the reason Michael had smelled like he did, the reason he dismissed my concerns with the condescending lie about my shampoo. The sheer audacity of using a spa receipt that could be easily traced, the casual cruelty of his deception, finally broke the dam. I drove home not with sadness, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. Michael was already there, changing out of his work clothes. He looked relaxed, oblivious. "How was your day?" he asked, smiling innocently. "It was enlightening," I replied, my voice dangerously level. "I spent the afternoon at the Azure Retreat. They have a wonderful custom scent there. Jasmine and Moroccan sandalwood. I booked the same session you had yesterday, Michael." The color drained from his face instantly. The smile vanished, replaced by sheer panic. He tried to scramble for an excuse, a denial, but he was drowning. I didn't let him speak. I laid out the receipt, the dates, the receptionist's confirmation, and finally, the fact that I had seen the woman leaving the facility. The confrontation escalated rapidly, the emotional tension snapping like dry wood. We weren't speaking anymore. We were shouting the unfiltered truth at each other across the kitchen island. I accused him of sacrificing our family for a cheap thrill. He screamed about feeling suffocated and misunderstood. We were so consumed by the violence of the argument that we didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching the kitchen doorway. Then, the world stopped. Michael was midway through shouting, "It meant nothing, David. It was just a mistake," when Ethan appeared. He had been quietly reading upstairs, likely drawn by the escalating volume. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't cry silently. He saw the broken pieces of his parents, and he understood. He looked at Michael, his father, who stood there sweating and defeated. And then he delivered the sentence that was worse than any divorce decree, any legal separation. "Get out. I never want to see you again." Michael left that night. He didn't try to reason with Ethan. He couldn't. The final blow wasn't delivered by the betrayed spouse, but by the innocent child whose world had been shattered by a lie wrapped in the scent of jasmine. The house is quiet now, unnaturally so. We are in the painful process of rebuilding, navigating custody arrangements, and explaining to Ethan that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes so big they break everything. I learned that trust is not a large, unbreakable structure. It's a million tiny details. The moment you smell something off, literally or figuratively, and the person you love offers an insulting, dismissive excuse, it's probably your shampoo. That is when you must pay attention. That small, irritating flicker of doubt is often the only honest compass you have left. Don't let their excuses blind you. If you're feeling that familiar twist of unease in your own life, don't dismiss the scent of trouble. Listen to that doubt. It might be the only thing saving you from a far greater heartache down the line. Tell me, have you ever caught a lie because of a smell? Let me know in the comments below. But that little voice, that compass of unease, refused to be silenced by rational thought or a dismissive hand gesture. I tried, desperately, to let the matter drop, to accept Mark's flimsy explanation that the sweet, cloying perfume, a scent absolutely foreign to my expensive citrusy preferences, was simply residual fragrance from a co-worker's office. "It's probably your shampoo," he'd said, and I had almost believed him, because believing him was easier than facing the abyss of the alternative. For 3 days after that initial confrontation, I was a ghost in my own home, gliding silently, observing. Every casual touch, every late-night text notification, every closed bathroom door became a loaded signal. My internal monologue was a relentless interrogation. Was he colder? Was he just stressed at work? Why did his clothes feel starched and unfamiliar, even after I washed them? I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was the destructive cycle of anxiety I had worked so hard to overcome. But anxiety doesn't usually smell like cheap vanilla and synthetic jasmine. The scent, that phantom evidence, had somehow bonded itself to the leather interior of his sedan. I noticed it most when I drove his car to the grocery store. A suffocating sweetness layered over his usual musky aftershave. It was like driving in a crime scene where the evidence had been carefully, but not thoroughly, wiped away. The air freshener he'd clipped to the vent, a generic mountain pine, was working overtime, desperately trying to mask the intruder. I started small. I checked the mileage log on the car app, a habit I developed after we decided to track our combined fuel efficiency. Mark often went to the gym after work, about a 6-mile round-trip detour. But lately, the weekly mileage was consistently inflated by 25 to 30 miles. When I asked him about it casually, he blamed the new construction detour near the office. "It adds 10 minutes and maybe 5 miles each way," he explained, without meeting my eyes. 5 miles each way. 10 miles total. That didn't account for 30 extra miles every week. That accounted for a destination. A consistent, secondary destination. My next step required patience and a level of deception that made my stomach churn. I needed access to his briefcase. Mark was meticulous about his work bag. It held his life, his laptop, his client files, and his wallet. It never left his sight. He had a small ritual every night, emptying his pockets, placing his wallet and keys on the antique mahogany dresser, and placing the briefcase neatly beside it. The opportunity came on a Friday night. We were having a quiet evening, supposedly, settling in to watch a movie, but Mark was restless. He kept checking his phone, excusing himself to the kitchen for water, and when the movie was only halfway through, he announced he was absolutely exhausted and needed to sleep. "I'll just finish this episode," I said, my voice carefully neutral, my heart hammering against my ribs. As soon as I heard the deep, even breaths coming from the bedroom, a sound I knew well, a sound I suddenly feared was a lie, I slid out of bed. The house was quiet, bathed in the blue glow of the street lamp outside. I moved like a predator, slow and deliberate, toward the dresser. The keys and wallet were easy to pick up. I didn't want the phone yet. That was the nuclear option. I needed physical, undeniable proof first. I picked up the heavy leather briefcase. It was slightly unzipped at the top. I took it into the living room, placing it gently on the carpet so the sound wouldn't travel. My hands trembled as I pulled the zipper all the way open. It smelled overwhelmingly of paper and faint leather, Mark's familiar masculine scent. Nothing suspicious. I sifted through the folders, client names, budget reports, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I reached into the small hidden mesh pocket, the one he used for charging cables and loose change. My fingers brushed against something soft, something textile. It wasn't a cable. I pulled it out. It was a small cream-colored piece of silk, no bigger than a handkerchief, neatly folded. It was expensive, the material cool and smooth against my thumb. It wasn't his. Mark didn't own anything silk, let alone cream-colored. And then the scent hit me, concentrated and overwhelming, trapped within the folds of the fabric. It was the same cloying, cheap vanilla and synthetic jasmine, only infinitely stronger, as if this piece of silk had been soaked in the woman's signature perfume. My vision tunneled. The air thickened, turning to dust. It wasn't just a faint trace on his jacket anymore. This was intimacy, a deliberate souvenir hidden in the compartment meant for his business tools. This wasn't a coworker giving him a hug. This was a secret, carefully guarded and poorly concealed. I held the silk in my hand, staring at it, my mind racing through all the possible, ludicrous explanations. Maybe it's a gift for his mother. No, she only wears expensive Chanel. Maybe it's a cleaning, cloth for a fancy lens. No, why would it smell like this? There was no rational explanation left. The small, irritating flicker of doubt I had felt days ago had ignited into a blinding, searing rage. He hadn't just been lying about the smell. He had been lying about his time, his mileage, and his exhaustion. I went back to the dresser. I picked up his wallet. It was thick with cards and receipts. I flipped through the cash slots until I found a wad of small folded paper. They were all restaurant receipts, but they were not from the places we frequented. I pulled one out, dated just 2 days prior. The Velvet Lounge, 2 dinners, 2 glasses of expensive wine. The timestamp was 9:47 p.m. He had told me he was stuck in a late meeting with the accounting team. I had sent him a text asking if he wanted me to save him dinner. He replied he was already eating pizza with the guys. The lies didn't just smell, they were physically documented, pressed into his wallet, demanding to be found. I knew in that exact moment that I couldn't simply go back to sleep. I couldn't pretend I hadn't found the silk, the receipts, the truth marinated in cheap perfume. I gripped the cream silk so tightly my knuckles turned white, the soft fabric feeling like razor wire in my hand. I walked silently back to the bedroom door, the adrenaline sharpening every one of my senses. I didn't need to yell, not yet. I needed him to wake up, to see me standing there, holding the proof. I needed the look on his face when he realized the lengths I had gone to, not because of paranoia, but because of a simple, undeniable truth delivered on the wind. I flicked on the light switch. The sudden glare illuminated the room, catching Mark mid-snore, his face slack and seemingly innocent. "Mark," I said, my voice dangerously low, stripped of all emotion, sounding foreign even to my own ears. He stirred, blinking against the harsh light, his brow furrowing in irritation. What time is it? Turn that off, honey." I took a step closer to the bed, letting the silk dangle just inches from his face. The vanilla scent hung heavily in the air between us. I think," I whispered. We need to discuss the detours you've been taking." His eyes, still clouded with sleep, finally focused on the cream fabric in my hand. In that instant, every ounce of feigned fatigue vanished. His face went bone white, the blood draining away, leaving behind a mask of sheer, paralyzing terror. That moment, that instant where his perfect world collapsed, that was my confirmation, far louder and more definitive than any scream or confession could ever be. I had listened to the smell, and now the truth was unavoidable, hanging heavy and sweet in our formerly shared space. His terror was delicious, yet it tasted like ash and bile in my mouth. I didn't need him to speak. That silent confession, the way his eyes registered absolute defeat, told me everything I had spent the last 3 weeks trying to deny. I hadn't wanted to believe the smell. We had the perfect life. Adam was everything I thought I wanted. Steady, kind, successful. 5 years of marriage, a mortgage on a beautiful house in the suburbs, plans for children that we had optimistically penciled in for the following year. Our routine was comforting, predictable, a sturdy vessel sailing on calm waters. I trusted him implicitly, blindly. He was my rock, my safe harbor, the one constant in an unpredictable world. That's why the first flicker of strangeness felt like an unwelcome, invasive draft in a perfectly sealed room, forcing me to question the very foundation of my security. It started subtly, maybe 3 weeks ago, just after he began taking those new consulting calls that kept him out until midnight. I was folding laundry, something mundane and domestic, and there it was. A scent. Not his cologne, not the fresh smell of outdoors he usually carried, but something foreign, synthetic, and oddly sweet, like cheap vanilla mixed with industrial solvent. It clung stubbornly to his favorite jacket, the expensive tweed one he insisted on wearing during his late nights at the office. I mentally chalked it up to the dry cleaner initially, or perhaps the overwhelming perfume of a new, overly enthusiastic colleague he had mentioned. I rationalized it, away, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the smell persisted. It wasn't a constant presence, only when he came home particularly late, claiming bone-deep exhaustion, his movements too careful, his kisses too brief. Then came the micro-changes. He started locking his phone screen down tight, angling it away from me even when we were just sitting together watching television. He'd flinch if I entered the study unannounced, shutting his laptop with a sharp, reflexive snap. He began showering immediately upon arrival, a new habit he explained away as needing to wash off the city grime. The little things that, individually, meant absolutely nothing, but when stacked together, started to resemble a rickety, leaning tower of lies, threatening to collapse under the slightest touch. I became a detective in my own home, a place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, my refuge from the world's harshness. I fought the urge to snoop for a long time. Trust, in my mind, was sacred, non-negotiable. But the knot in my stomach was tightening with every passing day, pulling me lower and lower into a paranoia I barely recognized. The sweet, cloying smell became my nemesis, a sensory trigger that canceled out logic and screamed betrayal. One afternoon, while Adam was supposedly at a regional sales conference across town, I finally broke. The need to know eclipsed my moral boundary. I went through his things, systematically, desperately. The study drawers were clean, his laptop history wiped clean. His wallet held only receipts for gasoline and standard office supplies. Frustration clawed at my throat. But the smell, that inescapable vanilla-tinged scent, was faint yet lingering, centered near his expensive leather briefcase. I needed more than a ghost of a fragrance. I needed substance. I checked the car, the place where he spent the most time commuting, the place where the outside world met our domestic bubble. I ran my hand frantically over the carpets and between the seats, feeling only dust and forgotten coins. My hope was dwindling, turning into a dreadful relief. Maybe I was just crazy. Maybe I was manufacturing drama. Then, 2 days ago, I found it. Not in his pockets, not in the console, but wedged deep beneath the back seat, stuck where the worn leather meets the metal mechanism. A tiny, almost insignificant shred of fabric. It was soft, plush, expensive feeling, and the color was a pale, unassuming cream. I held it up to the light, turning it over in my trembling fingers. It wasn't a color I owned, nor one I'd ever seen him wear. And on this small, seemingly innocent piece of cloth, the synthetic vanilla smell was concentrated, almost overpowering, proving its point with brutal finality. This wasn't just proof of an affair. This fabric felt like a fragment ripped from an entirely different life, a shadowy existence. Adam was meticulously constructing away from me. I kept the scrap hidden in my pocket for 48 agonizing hours, letting the suspicion ripen into certainty. I wanted to see his face when I presented the evidence, to watch the mask of the devoted husband crack without him having a split second to build a defense. I waited until tonight, after dinner, when the house felt quiet and domestic, and the contrast between our assumed intimacy and the crushing reality would be at its peak. I pretended to be tired, stretching out on the sofa, waiting for him to settle down, to drop his guard and offer a casual, unguarded smile. I let the silence stretch, heavy and thick, before I finally reached into my jeans pocket, pulling out the cream fabric, holding it loosely between my thumb and forefinger. "What is this, Adam?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the hysterics he must have been expecting, or perhaps hoping for. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving that horrifying bone-white mask of sheer, paralyzing terror. He stared first at the fabric, then back at me, his eyes wide and vacant, completely silent. But it wasn't the cream color, or even the telltale smell that had driven me mad, that finally sealed his fate. It was the texture, the weight, the way the specific shade caught the light. It was the sudden, awful realization that this soft, rich fabric wasn't a standard shirt or dress. It was the exact shade and material of the bespoke drapery I had idly seen, advertised 3 weeks prior on the website of The Obsidian Room. A place Adam swore he knew nothing about. A high-end, exclusive, and notoriously discreet club rumored to cater to tastes far darker and more demanding than simple pedestrian infidelity. The realization hit me like a physical blow, simultaneously freezing my blood and setting my nerves alight. The sweet, synthetic scent wasn't cheap perfume. It was the specific, strong air freshener used by that establishment, designed to mask the lingering smell of expensive cigar smoke, sweat, and fear. My husband wasn't merely having an affair. He was deeply involved in something terrifyingly deeper, something that smelled of secrets, vanilla, and utter destruction. And I, unknowingly, had just walked right into the epicenter of his lie. I, who had always prided myself on my keen intuition and sharp sense of detail, felt every certainty about my life collapse into a dense, paralyzing fog. That scent, vanilla and menace, didn't just suggest a tryst, it screamed conspiracy. A mistress might use cheap patchouli. A high roller in a backroom deal used institutional chemical warfare to mask desperation. The realization was colder and sharper than any knife. I was not dealing with a cheating husband, but an imposter occupying the skin of the man I loved, entangled in something that could erase us both. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Confrontation was out of the question. If he was involved in secrets requiring that level of sanitization, a direct accusation would likely lead to silence, denial, or worse, a quick, ruthless removal of the problem. My survival instinct, dormant until that moment, surged, demanding stealth. I had to know what the establishment was, and what its clientele did under the cloak of synthetic sweetness. The next few days were an exercise in psychological torture. I moved through our shared spaces, the kitchen, the bedroom, the living room, like a ghost, performing the duties of a devoted wife while observing him with the detached focus of an enemy spy. Every casual touch felt like an electrical current, testing the wires of his deception. He, in turn, was tense, his movements clipped. He checked his phone constantly, not subtly under the table, but with a furtive, almost aggressive vigilance, shielding the screen even when I was nowhere near. The small, familiar habits that once defined our comfort now became glaring red flags. He'd always left his wallet and keys on the antique mahogany dresser. Now, they were tucked deep into his pockets, even when showering. He changed the Wi-Fi password, claiming the old one was compromised, but the new password was an incomprehensible string of numbers and symbols, completely unlike his usual easy-to-remember family dates. He started taking late-night calls in the garage, speaking in low, modulated tones that abruptly ceased the moment I approached the utility door. My investigation began with the mundane. I started monitoring our joint bank accounts. The numbers were technically fine. No massive withdrawals, no suspicious luxury purchases. But there was a pattern of small, regular payments to an obscure digital services provider I didn't recognize. RV Logistics, Inc. They amounted to a few $100 weekly, enough to be dismissed as recurring bills, but too frequent to be casual. I flagged them mentally, knowing they were a breadcrumb trail. The real breakthrough came during one of his routine evening gym sessions. He had become meticulous about these, spending 2 full hours away. I knew this was my window. I slipped into his home office, a space he rarely allowed me to organize, knowing that men involved in clandestine activities often leave their most sensitive tools close by, believing their territoriality is protection enough. I started with the desk drawers, moving past the mundane papers and old tax forms. Nothing. I checked the laptop bag, only chargers and a water bottle. Then I remembered a tiny, almost invisible scratch on the bottom of his heavy oak filing cabinet, near the baseboard. It wasn't wear and tear. It looked like a tiny indentation from a tool. Pushing the cabinet away from the wall, my heart hammering. Against my ribs, I found it. A small magnetic lockbox, expertly hidden and painted the exact shade of the wall behind it. My hands trembled as I searched for a key. I scanned the room desperately, feeling the clock ticking towards his return. Then, I remembered his keychain, the one he guarded so fiercely. I ran back to the dresser where he sometimes carelessly tossed his work jacket, plunged my hand into the inner pocket, and pulled out the ring. There were 3 keys. The car, the house, and a tiny, almost ornamental silver key that definitely didn't belong to any lock we owned. It fit the box perfectly. Inside, there was no money, no burner phone, and no love letters. What I found was infinitely worse. The box contained 2 items, a heavy-duty, glossy black keycard, emblazoned with a minimalist, stylized logo of a crowned lion. A logo I vaguely recognized from obscure high society gossip blogs as belonging to an exclusive, members-only gambling den rumored to host serious, unsanctioned transactions, and a thick, folded legal document. The document was a loan agreement. A colossal, staggering loan agreement. The principal amount listed was 7 figures, far exceeding what our combined assets were worth. But it wasn't the amount that made the blood drain from my face. It was the collateral. Under the section marked Security, listed in precise cold legalese, was the full address of our house. The deed, signed by my husband. He had mortgaged our entire life, everything we owned, to fund whatever dangerous game he was playing inside that establishment that smelled of vanilla, cigars, and fear. I flipped the document over, scanning the signatures. The borrower was my husband. The lender, however, was not a bank. It was an entity called Vanguard Capital Holdings, but the signature below the company name, scribbled in a bold, almost arrogant hand, was accompanied by a secondary, small, stamped seal, the very same crowned lion from the keycard. This wasn't just gambling debt. This was debt owed to organized interests, secured by our home. The sweet, synthetic scent I smelled on his jacket wasn't just covering up an illicit rendezvous. It was the smell of desperation clinging to him after negotiating with predators who now owned the title to our existence. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he had leveraged our future and placed us directly in the crosshairs of people who operated outside the law. My doubts vanished, replaced by a crystalline terror. I was no longer investigating an affair. I was calculating our escape from financial ruin and, potentially, physical danger. I quickly replaced the documents and the keycard, locking the box and sliding the cabinet back into place, careful to wipe away any fingerprints. I was shaking so violently I had to lean against the wall, fighting the urge to vomit. I looked at the desk, the family photos, the framed diploma, all now legally belonging to the crowned lion. The sound of the garage door opening echoed through the quiet house. He was back early. I had mere seconds. I had to play the part, smile the innocent smile, and pretend the world hadn't just fractured beneath my feet. But as he walked in, sweaty from his workout, his eyes narrow and assessing, I knew one thing. I couldn't stay. The man standing before me was a liability, and I had just uncovered the evidence that turned me into a target. The sweet scent of synthetic vanilla was the fragrance of my impending destruction, and I had to run before the air freshener wore off and the true, brutal smell of fear filled our home completely. "How was your day, darling?" His voice was too smooth, too deep, like molasses poured over razor wire. He stood in the entryway, drying his neck with a small gym towel, the synthetic vanilla scent fighting a losing battle against the sharp metallic tang of sweat, and something else. Something vaguely chemical, like gun cleaner or stale blood. I couldn't quite tell. "Fine," I heard myself say, the word thin and brittle. I forced my mouth into the shape of a smile, the one I used for visiting relatives or uncomfortable work functions, the one that never reached my eyes. "Just finished prepping the salad. Did your workout go well?" "Grueling," he replied, and the way his gaze lingered, not on my face, but on the precise position of my hands resting on the counter edge, told me he was scanning for anomalies. He was looking for hesitation, for fear, for the slightest tremor that would betray the knowledge currently burning a hole through my stomach. I knew what I had just seen, and now I had to unsee it, at least until he left the room. We had built 5 years on a foundation of meticulously crafted normalcy. It wasn't until 3 months ago that the cracks started showing, not in the plaster of the house, but in the narrative of our life. It began subtly, insidiously. First, it was the phone, always face down, always vibrating silently on the counter, never ringing aloud. If I happened to touch it, even accidentally, he'd snatch it up with a startling speed, a low, guttural apology following swiftly after. Then came the money. "I handle the household finances. It's a shared responsibility we agreed upon." But the bank statements started to look like hieroglyphics. Massive, round figures moving in and out of an account, labeled only operational expenses, an account I was explicitly told never to touch, never to even mention. When I asked about the $30,000 withdrawal labeled equipment upgrade, he simply kissed my forehead, ruffled my hair, and said, "Babe, I told you I'm expanding the consulting firm. Big contracts mean big upfront costs. Stop worrying your pretty little head." The phrase, "pretty little head," was the real trigger. It was condescending, dismissive, and utterly unlike the respectful way he usually spoke to me. It made me feel like an accessory, a pleasant fixture in his beautifully organized life, rather than a partner. That night, the doubt solidified into a gnawing ache. I began to watch him, not as a loving wife, but as an investigator assigned to a cold case. Every business trip became suspect. Every late night meeting was cross-referenced with traffic patterns and caller ID logs I secretly accessed. I realized I didn't know the full name of a single person he worked with, nor the location of his alleged office building, despite living only 20 minutes away from the corporate park he claimed housed his firm. The true investigation, however, couldn't begin until last week. He'd left for a supposed conference in Seattle, giving me 3 days of complete, unsupervised access. I started with the obvious: the closets, the drawers, the briefcase. All clean, all sterile, smelling faintly of cedar and the ubiquitous vanilla air freshener he insisted on keeping plugged in every room. A detail I now understood was less about fragrance preference and more about sensory suppression. It was in the garage, tucked behind a shelf of old paint cans and forgotten gardening tools, that I found the lockbox. It wasn't one of those cheap metal boxes. This was a heavy-duty, fireproof safe, bolted to the concrete floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm against the silence of the empty house. He had always been meticulous, almost obsessively neat. The fact that this box was hidden in plain sight, behind clutter he usually purged, suggested two things. Either he thought no one would ever look there, or the contents were so sensitive he didn't dare hide it anywhere that required frequent access. I spent nearly 24 hours trying to open that box. I tried every combination I could think of: birthdays, anniversaries, forgotten pets, childhood addresses. Nothing. Frustrated, disheartened, I almost gave up. But the next day, while cleaning his study, an act of domestic routine I hoped would calm my nerves, I noticed a loose thread on the bottom cushion of his favorite leather chair. I pulled it, and the entire seam gave way, revealing a small, flat compartment stitched into the upholstery. Inside, wrapped in a plastic seal, was a key. It was heavy, silver, and had an unusual proprietary cut. Returning to the garage, my hands slick with adrenaline, I inserted the key into the lockbox. It turned with a satisfying, expensive click. I lifted the heavy lid. The vanilla scent of the house vanished completely, replaced by a cold, metallic dread. It wasn't money or love letters I found inside. It was an arsenal of identity. There were 3 separate, highly realistic State Department ID cards, each with his picture but different names. Names like Marcus Thorne and Elias Vance, complete with official-looking stamps and security holograms. There were also 2 burner phones, factory-sealed and untraceable, a small leather-bound journal filled with coded entries, and, most damningly, a flash drive encased in military-grade polymer. The label on the flash drive was scrawled in faint pencil: Assets. I didn't need to read, so the journal, or plug in the drive. The weight of the fake IDs alone told the whole story. The man I married, the supposed corporate consultant who worried about stock options and quarterly reports, was living a double, or perhaps triple life. He wasn't just secretive, he was dangerous. He wasn't just hiding assets. He was an asset, likely working for or against powerful people. My fingers trembled as I took rapid, high-resolution photographs of everything, transferring the images immediately to a secure cloud drive. I knew I couldn't risk taking the evidence with me. If he found the box disturbed, I was dead. I had to put everything back exactly as I found it. I had just managed to re-sew the chair cushion, my amateur stitches barely noticeable, when his text message flashed on my forgotten phone. Landing early. Be home in 30. Get ready for a proper welcome. That was an hour ago. Now he was standing 6 feet away, his eyes assessing, calculating. The evidence was secured, the compartment resealed, and the key back beneath the cushion. The vanilla air freshener was pumping its deceitful sweetness into the air, but all I could smell was the sharp tang of fear and the metallic scent clinging to his towel. "You look tired," he commented, taking a step closer. The casual concern in his voice felt like a heavy stone dropping onto my chest. "Just a long day," I replied, forcing my shoulders to relax. I needed him to shower. I needed 5 minutes. I needed to grab the pre-packed emergency bag I'd hidden in the spare tire well of my car, the bag I'd prepared based on nothing but a gut feeling, a feeling that had just been horrifically confirmed. "I'll take a quick rinse," he decided, smiling that innocent smile that had fooled me for half a decade. "Then we can properly relax." As he turned toward the hallway leading to the master bathroom, I gripped the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. The man standing before me was not my husband. He was a phantom, a construct, a liability, and now that I knew who Marcus Thorne was, I had just become a target. The water started running in the shower. I had maybe 3 minutes. I had to run before the true, brutal smell of fear filled our home completely, alerting him to the fact that his beautiful, compliant wife was gone. I just hoped those 3 minutes were enough to save my life. Because if he found those photos, there would be no discussion, no argument, only silence. This was not a divorce. This was an escape from a man who had proved he could erase people from existence and replace their identity with a new laminated card. He shower. I had maybe 3 minutes. I had to run before the true, brutal smell of fear filled our home completely, alerting him to the fact that his beautiful, compliant wife was gone. I just hoped those 3 minutes were enough to save my life. Because if he found those photos, there would be no discussion, no argument, only silence. This was not a divorce. This was an escape from a man who had proved he could erase people from existence and replace their identity with a new laminated card. The sound of the running water seemed impossibly loud, a roaring waterfall designed to mask the frantic pounding in my chest. But to understand the terror of those 3 minutes, you have to understand the decade of perfect silence that preceded them. The meticulous construction of a life that felt like a glass cage built just for me. My name is Alara. Or at least, that is the name printed on the driver's license he insisted I get 3 years ago, when we moved into this sprawling estate hidden deep in the hills. Before that, I was Lena. And before that, honestly, the memories blur. I met Victor 10 years ago in Vienna. He was charming, powerful, and utterly magnetic. He didn't just love me. He curated me. He bought my clothes, chose the books I read, dictated the countries we visited, and even subtly steered my friendships until my entire social circle consisted of his business associates and their equally compliant wives. I thought this was just how powerful men operated. Possessiveness mistaken for devotion. Our life was a masterpiece of polished mahogany, silent servants, and expensive champagne. It was flawless, utterly without friction, which I now realize was the first, most terrifying sign. The doubt started not with a bang, but with a faint metallic taste on my tongue whenever Victor kissed me goodbye before his business trips. He was a consultant, that vague, profitable title that explained away 3-day disappearances and highly encrypted satellite phones. I was happy, truly, or so I believed. My only job was to maintain the perfection of our home and be the perfect hostess. Until the key rang. It was a Monday morning, 6 months ago. Victor had rushed out for an emergency meeting, leaving his heavy leather briefcase on the kitchen counter, something he never did. I, the model wife, immediately went to retrieve it to take it to his study. But as I lifted it, a small silver keyring slipped out from an inner pocket, landing silently on the Persian rug. It held 4 keys: the house key, the car key, a small padlock key I recognized from his gym locker, and 1 key I didn't recognize at all. It was flat, unusually shaped, and made of brushed brass, clearly for a high-security lockbox. I placed the briefcase on his desk, but I kept the brass key. It was a violation of our unspoken agreement. His life was his. Mine was maintaining the facade. But that key was a shard of ice in the heat of my curiosity. What could he possibly have that required a lockbox that couldn't simply be secured in our safe? For weeks, the key burned a hole in my pocket. I watched Victor, meticulously observing his habits, his movements, the slight flicker in his eyes when he talked about his clients. He was too smooth, too rehearsed. He never worried. He never forgot. He was a machine, and I realized I had been married to a highly advanced automaton whose primary function was deception. The investigation began in earnest one Saturday afternoon when he was golfing with clients. I started in his study. The room was always kept pristine by the cleaning staff, but I knew the layout by heart. I systematically tested every drawer, every panel, every piece of furniture, looking for a hidden compartment or a false back. Nothing. The study was a red herring, designed to look like the center of his work, but it wasn't. Then I remembered the old wine cellar. We rarely used it. It was cold, dusty, tucked away beneath the garage, accessed by a narrow spiral staircase we'd inherited with the house. Victor always dismissed it as rustic clutter. I went down, flashlight in hand, the air thick with the smell of mold and fermentation. In the deepest corner, behind a rack of overpriced forgotten Bordeaux, there was a small modern wall panel, almost invisible against the rough stone. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the flashlight. I slid the brass key into the subtle lock. It clicked immediately, silently. Behind the panel was not a safe, but a lightweight steel cabinet, barely, the size of a microwave. I pulled the small door open. Inside, stacked neatly, were files and folders. The air rushed out of my lungs. This wasn't about money laundering or tax evasion. This was worse. The top folder was labeled E. Thorne. Inside were identification documents, a flawless Canadian passport, a UK driver's license, a social security card, and a birth certificate, all bearing the name Ilara Thorne, and all featuring my photo. But the date of birth was wrong, the city of origin was wrong, and the parents' names were strangers. I recognized the precision. The quality of the holograms was terrifyingly professional. He hadn't just given me an identity. He had manufactured a person and layered her over the ghost of who I used to be. The horror deepened as I pulled out the next folder. L. Kincaid. The photo was different. A young woman with striking red hair, sad eyes. Beneath her manufactured documents were two items that made my stomach revolt. A copy of a missing persons report from 2018, and a single faded photograph of a woman, undeniably Lena, smiling on a beach, her face scratched out with black ink. Below that, a list of known aliases and former addresses, including a street name I hadn't used in 15 years. Victor wasn't just a consultant. He was a ghost maker, an identity architect, and a silent executioner of past lives. He didn't just erase people, he replaced them with his own creations. And I, Ilara, was his latest and most successful project. I spent the next 3 months planning. I couldn't move too fast. Any change in my perfect, predictable rhythm would trigger his suspicion. I memorized the contents of the cabinet. I learned the routing of his security cameras. I learned that he showered precisely at 7 a.m. on Tuesdays, taking exactly 10 minutes, no more, no less, unless he was stressed, in which case it was 8. This morning, he was calm. 10 minutes. I didn't take the photos I found in the cabinet. They were too risky, too traceable. Instead, I took the small, high-density flash drive I had prepared weeks ago, containing digital copies of the most damning files, including the documents of L. Kincaid, and 3 other erased individuals. I slipped it into the lining of my running shoe, grabbed the small, pre-packed duffel bag hidden under the loose floorboard in the closet, and paused. The water pressure suddenly seemed to drop. 8 minutes. He was speeding up. I had to move. I had to disappear without leaving a single trace that Alara Thorne had ever questioned her existence. I looked around the gilded bedroom, the prison of perfect happiness. If I failed, I would not be the first life Victor had deleted. I knew exactly what he would do. He would report Alara missing. He would grieve for 3 months. And then, he would calmly manufacture a new identity to fill the vacancy I left behind, perhaps starting with a blonde, or maybe a quiet brunette who hated champagne. The thought of him calmly replacing me with another puppet fueled my legs. I slid down the main staircase, silently thanking the thick carpet for muffling my footsteps. The front door was electronically locked. Victor always insisted on the highest security. I input the override code, a code I discovered 6 weeks ago, not hidden in the study, but written in his archaic Latin, shorthand on the back of his favorite golf scorecard. Click. I pulled the heavy oak door open just a crack, letting the cold morning air rush in, a blast of freedom I hadn't tasted in a decade. I heard the shower stop. The roaring silence was deafening. I had maybe 30 seconds before he toweled off and noticed the slightly skewed angle of the bedroom door. I slipped out, pulling the door closed with agonizing slowness, making sure the electronic lock engaged with the softest thud. I ran across the gravel driveway, abandoning my duffel bag under the thick rhododendrons. It was too cumbersome. My life was reduced to the weight of the flash drive in my shoe and the phone I carried, containing the single, pre-programmed number of the only person I thought I could trust. Someone who didn't even know Alara Thorne existed. I reached the tree line and didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the cold, meticulous rage radiating from the house. A silent heat that meant Victor was already standing in the middle of the bedroom, his eyes scanning for the imperfection, the misstep, the first hint that his perfect wife had finally, dangerously, vanished. My escape was messy, terrified, and utterly necessary. I knew the moment he realized I was gone, he wouldn't call the police. He would activate the protocols for termination and identity destruction. I wasn't just running from him. I was running from the concept of myself. And I needed you to know before I completely disappeared that this story is proof that even in the most beautiful cages, the truth always leaves a key behind. If you feel that unsettling chill, that tiny misplaced detail that doesn't fit the perfect picture, don't dismiss it. Because sometimes that tiny detail is the only thing standing between your life and the laminated card of your replacement. Listen to that fear. Pay attention to the silence. Tell me, what's the smallest thing that feels wrong in your life right now? Because that is exactly where the answer hides. The key was buried not in the ground, but in the routine. That unsettling chill I mentioned had solidified into a block of Arctic ice in my chest, heavy enough to sink me. Simon's new cologne, cedar, musk, something aggressively clean, was no longer just an observation. It was a sensory violation. It wasn't the scent I associated with him, the one that meant home and safety. This new fragrance was the smell of a carefully constructed lie. It was too dominant, masking something else. And that was when I stopped being a wife and started being an investigator. My first target was the digital cage he carried everywhere, his phone. Usually, it was magnetically attached to his hand, hidden by passcodes, biometrics, and a professional level of paranoia. I needed space and time. I fabricated a medical emergency, a sudden, agonizing reaction to a new herbal supplement, sending him into a frantic, apologetic flurry to the farthest flung 24-hour pharmacy, one I knew would require at least 40 minutes of driving, navigating traffic, and waiting. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, The silence of our opulent apartment felt deafening. 40 minutes. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them flat against my thighs. I crept into our bedroom. There it was, sitting innocently on the nightstand, charging. The barrier wasn't the passcode, it was the biometric lock. I stood over him, remembering the dozens of times he'd drunkenly joked that his deepest secret lay under his thumbprint. This felt like the ultimate betrayal, not of him, but of the woman I used to be, the one who didn't need to violate trust to survive. I gently lifted his phone. His thumb, resting relaxed and limp in the deep sleep of exhaustion, or perhaps guilt, was placed over the scanner. Success. The screen flared to life, illuminating the fear etched on my face. I knew he wouldn't be stupid enough to leave explicit text messages or Tinder notifications. Simon was a master strategist. I went straight to the location data. The Maps application was the digital breadcrumb trail of his new life. And there it was, a recurring pattern. Not late nights at the office, but 3 consistent stops every week, always between 6:45 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. A high-end wine bar downtown, followed by a dry cleaner near the financial district, and finally, a residential street I didn't recognize in an increasingly fashionable, newly developed area. I cross-referenced the coordinates. The residential pin dropped onto a pristine, high-rise luxury building, the Crescent Towers. My gut twisted. This wasn't a quick affair in a cheap motel. This was high-level infrastructure planning. I then moved to the Photos app. Amidst spreadsheets and golf course pictures, I found a deeply hidden folder labeled Q4 Projections. Inside, there were no spreadsheets. Instead, there were dozens of high-resolution staged photographs. They weren't of a person, but of an apartment. A minimalist, brutalist, chic interior. Polished concrete floors, vast panoramic windows, a kitchen island made of flawless black granite. It was beautiful, cold, and utterly impersonal. But one detail made the blood drain from my face. On the living room wall, centered, perfectly above a low-slung Italian leather sofa, was a piece of modern art. A limited edition print by an artist Simon had explicitly ridiculed months ago at a charity auction. Mass-produced despair, he had scoffed. Yet, here it was, the centerpiece of this secret life. He wasn't just acquiring an apartment. He was acquiring a persona to fit that apartment. He was building an entire second identity, furnished and decorated, ready to occupy. I swiftly cleared the recent searches and locked the phone just moments before I heard the grind of the elevator descending. I was back in bed, feigning troubled sleep, when he finally came in, reeking of the pharmacy's antiseptic clean scent and that damnable cedar. He stroked my hair, his touch too careful, too practiced. The traffic was terrible, darling. You'll be fine. Just rest. Rest? I felt like a wire stretched taut, ready to snap. I spent the next 48 hours observing him, the apartment photos, burned behind my eyelids. The investigation needed to move beyond the digital and into the physical. I waited until Sunday morning. Simon was distracted, setting up a complex projection for a Monday meeting, immersed in his professional bubble. I went to his suit closet. I didn't search the pockets of his active clothes. He would check those. I went for the expensive 3-piece wool suit he wore only for major board meetings, hanging untouched for weeks. Deep inside the breast pocket lining, sewn almost invisibly, I found it. It wasn't cash or a note or even a condom. It was a small plastic laminated access card. The logo was the same stylized crescent moon as the building name, the Crescent Towers. Below the logo, printed in small, elegant type, Unit 1403. This wasn't a doubt anymore. This was a blueprint. He wasn't having an affair. He was executing a hostile takeover of my life, planning the transition so seamlessly that I wouldn't even notice I'd been evicted until the locks were changed. The card felt impossibly heavy, a physical manifestation of my worst fear. I decided then, I wouldn't wait for him to confess. I wouldn't wait for the dramatic confrontation. I needed to see Unit 1403. I needed to stand inside his secondary existence to understand the sheer scope of his calculated cruelty. Monday morning, I dressed meticulously, telling Simon I had a full day of overdue appointments. He kissed my forehead, distracted, and rushed out the door. I drove the opposite direction. The Crescent Towers stood like a monument to cold ambition. I felt the card vibrating in my palm as I approached the sleek, automated entrance. I swiped it. Access granted. The elevator ride to the 14th floor was the longest ascent of my life. I felt the oxygen thinning, replaced by pure, crystallized terror. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway until I reached 1403. I placed my ear against the polished mahogany door, listening for any sound of life, any sign of her. Nothing. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the one that tells you there's no turning back from the point of no return. I pulled the small metallic key that was also attached to the laminated card. I inserted it into the lock. It turned with a crisp, final click. The air that rushed out when I pushed the door open smelled exactly like the photos. New leather, fresh paint, and the pervasive, agonizing cedar cologne. But there was no woman waiting, no suitcase packed, no immediate evidence of a lover. The apartment was pristine, furnished exactly as I had seen in Q4 projections, ready for habitation. It was then, as my eyes scanned the sterile perfection, that I saw the detail that finally shattered me completely. On the black granite kitchen island, next to a brand new coffee machine, lay a stack of documents, organized neatly with rubber bands. On top of the stack was a large, glossy photo, a portrait of a woman smiling, her eyes bright and familiar. It wasn't a mistress, it was me. A portrait taken 6 months ago before I started noticing the cedar. But beneath the picture, clearly visible on the documents, were the words, Life Insurance Policy, Beneficiary S. Williams. And beneath that, a folder labeled in Simon's precise, detached handwriting, Transition Plan, Post-Relocation. He hadn't been planning to cheat on me. He was planning to erase me and move his new, pristine life into the space he'd already prepared. I wasn't being replaced. I was being liquidated. And the clock was ticking. I had to move, and I had to move now, because the truth I was holding wasn't a key to my freedom. It was the map to my grave. The map to my grave was detailed, precise, and utterly horrifying. I slammed the heavy drawer shut, the sound muffled by the thick mahogany but deafening in the silence of Simon's study. My heart was not merely pounding. It was trying to claw its way out of my chest, a frantic caged bird fighting for air. I didn't dare lean against the desk. I needed to leave no trace, no residue of my presence that could betray the fact that I now held the knowledge of my own expiration date. I wasn't grieving a marriage. I was mourning my future, the one I had naively built with this man who, it turned out, saw me as little more than a necessary step in an elaborate, calculated financial maneuver. He hadn't been planning a breakup. He had been planning an acquisition, and I was the asset being liquidated. The immediate terror was paralyzing, yet strangely focusing. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. Simon would be back from his conference call in less than an hour, and I had barely scratched the surface of his meticulously constructed facade. That folder, transition plan, post-relocation, felt like a biological hazard. I had to know what was inside, but I couldn't risk leaving it open on his desk. Moving swiftly, my movements cold and mechanical, I slid the folder into the safe harbor of my oversized handbag, knowing I would need to analyze its contents later, under the cover of darkness and distance. But I still needed proof. Something undeniable, digital, and transferable. Simon was a man of paper trails, yes, but he was also a man of meticulous digital encryption. I remembered the small, black external hard drive he kept hidden. Not in the study, too obvious. Not in his wallet, too exposed. It had to be where his guard was lowest, where routine made him blind. I walked quietly down the hall to the master bathroom, a space that smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood and the utter lack of genuine intimacy. My hands, now steady despite the internal tremor, moved to the false bottom of his shaving kit. There it was, a thumb-sized black flash drive, labeled innocuously as Tax Files 2023. I retreated back to the study, plugging the drive into my old laptop, the one Simon deemed too slow for his professional standards. It immediately requested a password. My mind raced through the obvious. Our anniversary, his birthday, the name of his first cat. All failed. He was far too careful for sentimentality. I stared at the screen, biting down hard on my lip until I tasted copper. What had changed recently? Simon had developed new habits, subtle shifts in routine that I had dismissed as work stress. He had started wearing a specific signet ring again, one he hadn't touched since college. He'd also obsessively returned to an obscure piece of classical music, a section of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, the sacrificial dance. I had found it jarring, almost violent. Sacrificial dance. A cold wave washed over me. I typed the initials of the piece, T-Sots, failed. I tried the full name, The Rite of Spring, failed. Then I remembered a drunken conversation years ago about how he admired the sheer mathematical precision of Stravinsky's rhythm. I typed in the year of the premiere, 1913. Access granted. The screen flashed green. The contents spilled out, and they weren't tax files. They were spreadsheets that mapped out the next 4 weeks, color-coded like a morbid Gantt chart. There were links to encrypted communication logs, property deeds for a remote cabin in upstate New York purchased under an LLC, and an alarmingly large wire transfer to an offshore account labeled simply execution fee. My breath hitched. S. Williams wasn't just a beneficiary. She was the new identity being adopted after my disappearance, the recipient of the clean slate Simon was building. The transition plan wasn't divorce, it was disposal. I opened the communication logs. They were between Simon and an unknown party, likely the person facilitating the relocation. The language was sickeningly sterile. S. Confirmed site viability. Liability must be neutralized before the 15th. U. Protocol 7 initiated. Target acquisition scheduled for the 14th during the scheduled weekend getaway. Ensure absolute isolation. Today was the 11th. I had less than 72 hours until my weekend getaway became my final resting place. The fear solidified into a glacial resolve. I had to assume Simon had surveillance, a camera, a listening device, something. I couldn't call the police. I had a flash drive full of circumstantial evidence and a life insurance policy, but I needed to escape the physical threat first. If I confronted him, he would simply speed up the timeline. I quickly initiated a total data duplication onto a microscopic SD card I kept hidden inside a lipstick tube. While the files copied, I navigated to his recent browser history, finding confirmation that he had recently purchased specialized tools, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, quick-drying cement, and a high-frequency signal blocker. Tools for a construction project, he'd claimed, but now I knew they were tools for a cover-up. Files copied successfully. I ejected the flash drive, wiped my laptop's recent activity, and replaced the drive in the shaving kit with surgical precision. I was sweating, but my hands were steady, focused entirely on the immediate tactical objective: survival. Just as I slid the lipstick tube into my jeans pocket, I heard the faint, distant hum of the automated gate opening, followed by the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Simon was home, 30 minutes early. I froze by the study door, my reflection in the dark glass a perfect mask of calm. I took one deep, shuddering breath, locking the knowledge of the transition plan deep behind my eyes. I had to become the loving, oblivious wife again, just long enough to walk out that door and disappear into the night before Simon realized the victim had seen the map to the grave and chosen a different route. I wasn't just leaving him. I was going into hiding, knowing that the man I married was now a professional predator, and I was his final, most valuable prey. The air in the kitchen was thick and sweet, with the aroma of the slow-cooked roast I'd prepared, a domestic scent that now tasted like poison in my mouth. I forced a slight, tired smile as Simon entered, his suit jacket, already off, tie loosened, radiating the effortless charm of a man who had just closed a successful deal. He kissed my forehead, a brief, proprietary touch that used to anchor me, but now felt like the brand of an owner marking his livestock. "Rough day, sweetheart?" he murmured, pouring himself a scotch. His voice was smooth, deep, utterly normal. This was the terrifying thing. There were no horns, no sharp teeth protruding, just this meticulously crafted shell of a loving husband, designed to lull me into perfect compliance until the moment the blade descended. "Just paperwork," I lied easily, the lie sliding over my tongue like polished glass. I had spent 7 years practicing this routine, never knowing I was practicing for my own survival. I watched him settle into his armchair, the flickering TV reflecting in his cold, intelligent eyes. Was this the moment? Could he tell the tremor in my hand as I lifted my wine glass? The truth was, the mask hadn't slipped for the first time today. It had been chipping away for months, starting with those tiny, insidious scratches that I had desperately tried to rationalize away. I remember the first time I felt the icy spike of doubt. It was last winter, when he returned late from a conference in Zurich. He was tired, but not tired enough to forget to wipe down his suitcase meticulously before putting it away. Not just the wheels or the handle, but every square inch of the nylon shell. Why? I'd asked myself. Why the obsessive sterilization of luggage? Then came the financial anomalies. Simon handled all our investments, boasting about his Midas touch. But 3 months ago, while retrieving a tax document, I stumbled upon a secondary ledger hidden within a password-protected folder labeled recipes. It wasn't the amount of money. Simon was wealthy. That wasn't the surprise. It was the source codes. Large, untraceable transfers moving through, shell corporations with names like Ouroboros Holdings and Styx Logistics. These weren't the names of legitimate business acquisitions. They sounded like names lifted from a thriller novel. I dismissed it, of course. Stress, I told myself. Simon is under pressure. My brain was determined to protect the idyllic life we had built, brick by brick, even if the foundation was cracking. But the cracks widened. There was the burner phone, a cheap, outdated Nokia, hidden inside, a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick on his bookshelf. It wasn't the phone itself that terrified me, but the singular cryptic text message displayed when I dared to turn it on during one of his long fishing trips. Target acquired, transition initiated. It was a language of clinical detachment, chillingly devoid of emotion. Transition. That word haunted me, echoing with the sound of finality. The true investigation began then, driven by a fear so potent it tasted metallic. I started digging, carefully, stealthily. I learned to read the reflection in his glasses when he worked late, to measure the length of time he spent showering after certain business calls, and to interpret the subtle changes in his email cadence. I was no longer a wife. I was a forensic analyst operating within enemy territory. My biggest breakthrough, the one that shattered the last remnants of my denial, happened 3 weeks ago. Simon had insisted I take a spa. Weekend. A gesture of affection that now felt sickeningly calculated. Instead of leaving, I pretended to go, driving halfway to the coast before doubling back and slipping into the house through the basement window. I knew he kept his most sensitive documents locked in his antique mahogany desk. I had the key, a copy I'd secretly made years ago, thinking it might hold keys to a surprise birthday gift. Inside, I didn't find love letters or hidden mistresses. I found organization charts, risk assessment profiles, and detailed surveillance reports. The targets were all high-net-worth individuals who had mysteriously vanished over the last decade, their disappearances officially ruled as accidents or voluntary flights. Then, buried beneath a stack of documents labeled Project Cerberus, I found my file. It was titled, starkly, Alice Sterling, Final Asset Transition Protocol. The document was clinical, horrifyingly precise. It detailed my routines, my habits, my medical history, and my emotional vulnerabilities. It outlined the exact financial maneuvers needed to liquidate my trust funds without raising regulatory alarms. It even included a timeline that ended in the next few weeks. The transition plan wasn't about a corporate merger. It was about my erasure. It explained how Simon planned to stage my disappearance during our planned summer vacation. A remote cabin trip he had suddenly become obsessed with organizing. The map I saw, the one I locked behind my eyes, was a diagram of the land surrounding that cabin, complete with coordinates marked Disposal Site Alpha. That night, huddled under the covers of my own bed while he slept soundly beside me, I realized the man I loved was a high-functioning psychopath, a professional who viewed human life as expendable assets, and our marriage as the perfect cover and access point. My investigation was over. The verdict was guilty. Now sitting opposite him, watching him casually scroll through the news, I had to be flawless. Every movement, every word had to reinforce the illusion of the oblivious wife, blissfully unaware that her final scene was already written. "Darling," I said, my voice steady, perhaps a little too sweet. "I need to run to the pharmacy tonight. I'm completely out of my migraine medication, and you know how I get if I miss a dose." I watched him. This was the critical point. My escape hinged on a believable, mundane excuse that required my physical absence from the house, preferably after dark, when the security cameras focused more on outside threats than on internal movements. His eyes flickered up, momentarily calculating. "Can it wait until tomorrow, Alice? It's late." "I wish," I sighed, rubbing my temples dramatically. "But I really don't want to be a wreck for our dinner tomorrow night. You know how important that client meeting is." The mention of his work obligation seemed to satisfy the professional part of his brain. He needed me functional tomorrow. He needed the mask intact. "Fine," he conceded, already returning his attention to the screen. "Be quick and take the keys to the SUV. The sedan needs gas." I nodded, a wave of cold relief washing over me. The SUV? Perfect. The sedan had the hidden tracking device. I'd found it weeks ago. He thought he was giving me a favor, but he was handing me my freedom. I stood up, adjusting my skirt, feeling the reassuring weight of the small concealed package I wore under my clothes. My essentials, passport, emergency cash, and the untraceable satellite phone. The key to the SUV felt heavy and warm in my palm. "I won't be long, my love," I promised, leaning down to give him a final, lingering kiss. It was a kiss of farewell, a salute to the 7 years of beautiful lies, and a declaration of war. As I pulled away, I saw a fleeting expression of confusion cross his face, quickly masked. Had I lingered too long? Had I betrayed the depth of my performance? No time to worry. I walked toward the mudroom, my legs feeling simultaneously weak and intensely powerful. One step, then another. I was just the loving wife grabbing her coat and keys. But behind that calm facade, the transition plan was fully operational. I was the one initiating the transition now, and Simon would soon realize his prey had seen the map to the grave and chosen a different route entirely. As I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoed in the silence, sealing the boundary between the false safety of the house and the desperate, terrifying freedom of the night. I wasn't just leaving him. I was going into hiding, knowing that the man I married was now a professional predator, and I was his final, most valuable prey. And I had exactly 12 minutes before he realized the migraine excuse was just a cover, and the hunt officially began. And I had exactly 12 minutes before he realized the migraine excuse was just a cover, and the hunt officially began. I didn't run down the driveway. That was too obvious, too cinematic. Instead, I moved silently across the damp grass of the neighbor's yard, the cool dew soaking my thin socks, the only sound the frantic thumping of my own heart trying to escape my chest. I carried nothing but a small crossbody bag containing my burner phone, 3 debit cards linked to hidden accounts I'd established over the last 6 months, and the single, encrypted thumb drive, the real weapon. 12 minutes. That was the time it took for the Tylenol PM I had crushed into his evening tea to fully take effect, combined with the normal duration of a migraine nap. But even slightly groggy, he was still Matt, the man who could track a whisper across continents. My escape had to be flawless, designed by someone who understood operational security as well as he did. Thankfully, I had an ally who understood it better, my sister Clara, a former intelligence analyst. I reached the thick cedar hedge bordering the estate. Beyond it, not 20 feet away, a black, unmarked SUV sat idling softly, its lights off, blending perfectly with the moonless night. Clara was behind the wheel, her face a pale mask of anxiety and resolve. I slipped through the gap in the foliage, ignoring the scrapes on my arms, and lunged into the passenger seat. "Go. Now," I whispered, not daring to raise my voice above a breathless sigh. Clara didn't respond with words, only the fierce, focused acceleration of the engine. She drove slowly at first, meticulously obeying the speed limit through the neighborhood streets, blending with the late-night traffic until we hit the main highway. Only then did the speed increase, the world outside becoming a blur of smeared lights, pulling me further and further away from the gilded cage I had called home. We drove for 4 hours, non-stop, changing vehicles twice, exactly as planned. The first change happened in a desolate truck stop parking lot, where we transferred into a battered, decade-old sedan, the kind of car Matt would never bother to register in his mental database. Clara handed me a set of prepaid credentials, a new ID, a new name, Eliza Vance, and a train ticket. "You're on your own now, kiddo," Clara murmured, pulling me into a fierce hug. "The safe network is expecting you in Montreal. Don't contact me. Don't contact anyone. If he finds me, he finds you. Stay dark." Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't allow them to fall. Emotionality was a weakness he could exploit. I nodded, grasping the ticket like a lifeline. "Thank you, Clara. If I survive this, I owe you everything." "Just survive," she insisted, her voice tight. The train journey was a blur of paranoia. Every shift, in the seat behind me, every unexpected stop, sent jolts of pure terror through my body. I spent those 19 hours staring at my reflection in the dark window glass, not recognizing the pale, haunted woman looking back. She looked older, harder, stripped bare of the easy confidence that came with money and perceived safety. I was just prey now, hiding in plain sight. When I finally reached the safe house, a small, anonymous apartment above a bustling bakery in an immigrant neighborhood of Montreal, I didn't feel relief. I felt the heavy, crushing weight of reality. The agency assisting me was specialized, dealing with high-value witnesses and victims of organized crime, which was exactly what Matt had become. The first week was spent in debriefings, recounting every chilling detail of the last 2 years, the subtle manipulations, the coded meetings, the realization that our perfect life was merely a sophisticated front for illicit data brokerage and corporate espionage. They confirmed what I knew. My testimony and the data on the thumb drive were enough to dismantle his operation and put him away for life. But Matt wasn't arrested immediately. The agency needed time to coordinate with international authorities. For 3 agonizing months, I lived as Eliza Vance, learning to bake bread during the day, sleeping with a knife under my pillow at night. The silence was the hardest part. The silence meant he was hunting, and I had no way of knowing how close he was. Then came the call. It was a cold, official voice on the burner phone, informing me that the operation had been executed successfully. Matt, the ruthless, untouchable architect of my downfall, had been apprehended during a high-stakes meeting in Monaco. The charges were comprehensive, the evidence undeniable, largely thanks to the meticulously collected records I had risked everything to retrieve. A profound, shattering exhaustion washed over me. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was the collapse of a dam that had held back a lifetime of fear. I was safe, legally protected, and Matt was gone. But I had lost everything else. My name, my home, the easy belief in human goodness. Months passed before the new equilibrium set in. I kept the name Eliza Vance. I kept the small apartment. I kept baking bread. I learned that freedom isn't found in grand gestures, but in the small daily act of choosing what to put your energy into. The greatest lesson was not about escaping a monster, but about how easily a monster can wear the face of your beloved. I had spent years ignoring the chilling disconnect between his public charm and his private coldness, rationalizing away the locked study, the late-night calls in hushed tones, the predatory glint in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. My intuition had screamed, but my heart, clinging to the sunk cost of our history, had whispered excuses. I am safe now. The world is quieter, smaller, but it is real. The shadow of Matt still lingers sometimes, a sudden noise in the night, a familiar cologne scent on the street, but it fades faster now. I look at the people around me, the customers who smile as they buy their sourdough, and I see humanity in its messy, unfiltered glory, not the calculated facade Matt perfected. If you are listening to this, and you recognize that chilling knot of anxiety in your own stomach, the one that tells you something fundamental is wrong behind the beautiful facade of your life, listen to it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't wait for proof. Get the evidence, make the plan, and run. Because the greatest danger isn't the explosion. It's the insidious, silent corrosion of trust that happens right under your nose. Your life is not a movie plot. There are no second takes. And the people who seek to control and manipulate rely entirely on your silence and your self-doubt. Don't give them either. If you have been through something similar, if you have faced down your own silent predator and found your way out, share your story in the comments below. We need to hear those voices. They are the beacons for those still trapped in the dark.